So we're going to be talking about dyslexia, what it is, how to spot those signs, and most importantly, how to support a child who has dyslexia. This is such an important topic, and we know that so many parents have questions about dyslexia, so we're very happy to be here and hopefully help. So I'm really excited to have Sandra Pine with us. Sandra is a qualified dyslexia specialist, a former literacy teacher, and maybe most importantly, a parent of a child with dyslexia. So she really understands this from both a professional and personal perspective. So we're going to be talking through what dyslexia is, how to know if your child has it, what you can do to help them at home, and talking around can children with dyslexia still succeed? And a little spoiler alert, yes, they can. So we'll get started. Sandra, thanks so much for being here. I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you're so passionate about supporting children with dyslexia.
Oh, thank you so much for that. So, as Adrienne said, I'm Sandra, and I am really, I think, passionate about supporting children with dyslexia for a couple of reasons. It was just something that always interested me, right from when I was a student. I studied linguistics and phonetics at university. I lived with, at the time, and she still is, my very best friend, and she really seemed to have problems with reading and spelling. So it was really an interest from way back when. And then, life happens and I became a teacher. And then, I had my own children, and then my son turned out to be dyslexic. So it kind of came full circle from having a kind of an academic interest to a much more practical interest in the classroom and with my own children. So what I hope to do today is to give you, some clues about how to spot potential dyslexia in your child, what to do about it, how to support you and your child, because I think as a parent you also need a little bit of support. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm a former primary school teacher, 15 years teaching years 1 and 2, phonics, literacy, and the older ones a little bit as well, native speakers, non-native speakers, and I qualified as a dyslexia specialist because children just seem to need quite a bit more help. So I thought it would be really interesting to do that. And I am, as we know, the parent of a dyslexic child, and for sure 2 who aren't. So what I would like to do is introduce my children to you. They're kind of slightly older now. They've all finished school. And I would like to ask you, if you have a look at my 3 children, same parents, same school, often the same teachers. So I'm hoping to show you how different children in the same family can be quite different. Which one of my children do you think is dyslexic? And you can have a guess. And at the end, we will come back and I will talk a little bit more about the 3 of them. So I'm sure you already have made your guesses already. And I think the one thing I do want to show you, the advantage of having slightly older children, is I can give you a how it started and a how it's going perspective, because a kind of what's going on then is not necessarily what's going on now. And I want to give you some hope and some evidence that, things do sometimes feel quite tough, but they can often get better. And like I said before, siblings can be incredibly difficult. Adrienne, you can probably tell me the same story of siblings, right?
Absolutely. I know children that I've worked with who I've taught their brothers and sisters, and we all know that children can be so different, and the same goes for learning difficulties. You can have a child who loves reading, excels in reading and writing, and then a child from the same parents who just doesn't. And I think parents often maybe wonder why, the other one never struggled. Why is this one struggling? So I think being able to shine some light on that's actually really, really important.
Yeah, and I think I want to say, if you are one of those parents with children who can read well and love it and do it, and maybe you have a child who doesn't, it isn't actually anything you're doing. It really isn't. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But Before I even sort of talk about what dyslexia is, because I think we all have a rough idea of what it is. It's a, a difficulty with reading and spelling in the ways that one child might have and children who've been in the same class, in the same environment, don't have. I really want to just give you an idea of where I'm coming from when I talk about dyslexia, so you've got my kind of perspective on it. And I think the first thing I want to say is I'm pretty against these terms, disability, diagnosis. I don't even really like neurodivergent. I get why we need to say it, because we need to explain that something different is going on, but I don't come at it from a kind of medicalized negativity point of view. I think it's a way of thinking, it's a way of being, it's a way of processing. We have always been like this, we will always be like this. And it's just a difference in processing. It's not really, it's a difficult thing to manage. Of course, we all want to be literate. It's really handy. It's a useful skill to have. But the real negativity around it is not something that I go for. How about you, Adrienne? What's your feeling about it?
I think so. And I think a huge thing that we often forget is when anyone struggles with something, it doesn't mean they struggle with everything. And in a similar way, often children who have dyslexia can be so much stronger in other areas. They're creative, they can be fantastic problem solvers. And I think being able to recognize that actually some of the most successful people were dyslexic. I know Albert Einstein was dyslexic. I'm pretty sure Richard Branson as well. So just because they find reading and writing difficult, I think it's important to realize that they can excel in creative and entrepreneurial and all those different ways.
And also, I was just this week, I popped up on one of my social media feeds that GCHQ actually actively wants people who identify as neurodivergent, because it's a way of thinking that not everybody has. And it's, the value is in the difference and the variety. So I thought, yeah, that was definitely a good one to spot this week. The second thing that I would like to talk about, and this is one of those big ideas, is that our brains were actually never designed to read and write. They were designed for speech, because we can talk, and we can talk so easily and naturally, and it comes with no effort and no learning. We kind of assume that reading and writing should be like that, and that's absolutely not the case. Reading and writing completely piggybacks on our ability to speak. And when you think about it, it makes lots of sense, because for how long in our history, in the history of humans, have we been literate? I don't know, a couple of 100 years max. We never really needed it then, and there will come a point where we won't need it in the future, because already we're leaving voice notes, or we're getting text messages read to us, or we're using visuals or video. So I think there is a point where we will need it a lot less. It's just now it's really very critical in our history and our development, but it is really not something we are designed to do.
And you'll notice children as well that have dyslexia, they'll be able to communicate and speak at a much higher level than what they can read and write. So I think that's important to note as well.
Yeah, it's true. Dyslexic people can be very orally very strong and very communicative and have a great vocabulary. They just might not be able to read or write. And I think the point I'm just following along here, is there just is no evolutionary advantage in it. It's very, very useful. And of course, we would like to make it as possible for as many people as possible. But, our brains are just not designed to do it, really. One of the other things that I really want to talk about, because it's not really obvious, is that not all written languages are created equal. And so English orthography, so the spelling system of English, is an absolute outlier. It is a very, very difficult language to learn to read and write in. And I think that's so valuable to have in the back of your head when you think about what we're asking our children to do. And I've created a little graphic for you here. And you can see lots of bar charts with lots of percentages and lots of flags and all the rest of it. And the point is, English is the least dyslexia-friendly language for reading and spelling because the letters and the sounds just don't match all that well. And if you have languages like, you can see there, like Spanish, like Italian, if you have languages where the letters and the sounds match, it's really very easy, or much easier, to teach children to read and write in those languages, because you can basically give them the code, you know, to crack. You can give them the key to crack the code that is reading. And English is just a code you can't completely crack. There is a point where you just have to learn it, and it just has to become automatic. And we'll have a look at that in a little bit more detail, because I want to try and give you a sense of what being dyslexic is like. So when you see these different languages here, so we've got, what have we got? Spanish, and we've got Italian, and we've got German, and we've got Russian, and we've got French, and we've got English. That 40% that you can see for English is that part of the language where the letters and sounds do match, which is effectively phonics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why a lot of parents I talk to, you know, when we think about phonics, it seems like this big scary idea. And it can be tricky to wrap your head around, because there are so many different ways to spell the same sound. There's a lot of words that don't fall within that regular rule. So a lot of exceptions. So this makes it all make sense, really.
Yeah, or not. Makes
Yeah.
40% of it make sense and 60% of it not. Yeah, it's really, it's I think it's such an irony that English is such the world language, the global language, the lingua franca, but actually spelling and reading it is a real task. It would be so much easier for all of us if Spanish or Italian were the world language, but it isn't. Here we are. This is where we're at. So what I kind of want to say to you is that skilled reading is very automatic reading with comprehension. So it's not sounding out the letters, because we've just seen you can only do that successfully for about 40% of words. And it's also not guessing. So when I'm talking about skilled reading, I'm definitely talking about kind of reading without thinking about it, like I would imagine quite a few of us can already do. And we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail. But one of the things that I would say dyslexia definitely is, it's that inability to read and spell automatically without thinking about it very much. And I think, Adriana, you will know this, that there's nothing wrong with sounding out. Guessing, not so ideal, but if you're guessing from the clues in the text, that's fine to be doing that, to be sounding out at a certain point, right, in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think children who are taught how to read through phonics, it teaches them to be able to spot those sounds, break words down, but you do want them to get to a point where it becomes automatic and they're not needing to decode and blend. They can eventually read most words by sight. And often you'll know that children with dyslexia are those children who are working so hard all the time because it doesn't come as naturally to them.
Because at the end of the day, skilled reading is reading every word automatically. So, you know, you read cat automatically. Nobody who is a skilled reader says k-a-t, you know, and nobody who is a skilled reader would try and sound out because, and you read cat and because, you know, these very different kinds of words equally automatically. And so that's what skilled reading is. So we'll talk about dyslexia, and we'll talk about dyslexia where it isn't automatic. But first of all, to give you an example of just how tricky English is, have a look at my excellent selection of pictures here and see if you can match an OUGH word with one of those pictures. I think I would probably manage about 2 of those if this were up to me. But we've got, I'll give you a few clues, you know, we've got a tree, and tree has different parts. It has trunks and it has twigs and all the rest of it. The lion is jumping somewhere. Somebody is having that's the noun we need there, right at the bottom there. If you've got a cold, you often have one of those things. She's a big, strong woman. And I couldn't think of a good picture for the last one. So if you have got 6 OUGH words there, well done. Shall we check and see if you got more right? So we've got bow, and we've got through, and we've got thought, and we've got cough, and we've got tough, and we've got all those. So what you see, the difficulty with English, is you get the same string of letters. And in this case, you've got 6 different ways of pronouncing that same string of letters. And that's why you can't really sound out English, because how would you know? In this case, you only know because you've learned it already, and it comes automatically to you. So if you see, somebody with a cough, you're not going to go, oh, they have a cow, or they've got a cuff, or they've got a co. You know, because it's automatic for you that OUGH matches cough. And when you're reading those words in a bigger text, you'll obviously be using your understanding of the text to help you, identify which word that is. So when we say it has to be automatic and you can't sound it out, this is the kind of thing we're talking about, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is where if children have a wider vocabulary and they're exposed to a range of texts, it can really help them to just know that this is all the different ways that sound can sound in different words. It's not really, you can never teach all the exceptions, but that exposure over time, children will learn that actually it can be used in all these different ways.
Yeah, it's kind of jumping into the thing that I've got on the bottom of the next slide, which is really, it sounds really simple, but reading teaches reading at the end of the day. It's a bit like being a driver, a learner driver. You're only going to get really good at it if you can just keep practicing until it becomes automatic. So that's what I was trying to explain here. Skilled reading is automatic reading, but with comprehension. So you knew those OUGH words because you'd seen them often enough to recall them automatically. And that's the difficulty with dyslexia, because dyslexia is hard, it's difficult, you've got a lot to process, and it doesn't come easily automatically. So it's that lack of automatic reading that I would say is one of the very clear characteristics of dyslexia.
Can I ask you a question, Sandra, that I get asked a lot from some parents? If your child is potentially dyslexic, they find reading difficult, challenging, how would a child like that be able to be exposed to all of these if these different examples of through that you've just shown, how would they be able to be exposed to that if they're not the ones reading? What would you suggest to parents?
I think the very first thing you have to do with reading is to make it not stressful, because as soon as there's any level of stress that comes in, it really, as soon as it stops being fun, everything shuts down. So make it a stress-free, enjoyable experience, and ask your child to do as much as they actually can do, but also understand that if they really can't do very much, then read to them, or ask them to tell you the stories from the pictures. You might like to have some audiobooks around that they can listen to while they're playing, or that they get a really positive experience of reading and stories, and then you can just really build it up from there. So I think, don't sit down with your child and, until you've read me 3 pages, we are not going to stop, because if you turn them off, then it's over. It's going to be hard enough anyway. So just make it a really enjoyable experience. I don't know, what other tips would you have?
Yeah, I'd say exactly the same. Sometimes what I've done with children in the past is take turns reading. You read a line, I read a line. Or if they're able to do a bit more, then you could say, you read a page, I'll read a page. But there's been times where I know that if I ask them to read and actually they're either not in that mindset or they're finding it really difficult that day, because every day is different as well, I think actually they're going to get a lot out of being read to. They're still going to be exposed to that vocabulary. They're still going to be able to discuss what's being read. So actually, even that in itself is a great opportunity for them too.
Yeah, read them the story and then look at the picture, and you can even start to practice those higher level thinking skills, like what do you think will happen?
Mm-hmm.
Or what could possibly happen next? Or what do you think that character said? Or what, how do you think that character feels? You can involve them in all those really important parts of reading that just might not be decoding those words, in that certain amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely. So when I think, we have this one, don't we? So skilled reading is definitely automatic reading with comprehension. It's not sounding out, it's not guessing. And I think one of your questions that came in, what is dyslexia? And I would say dyslexia is a failure of or a struggle with automatic reading and spelling. It's like being stuck in learner driver mode. When you first start to learn to drive and you think, how am I ever going to manage to control this car and figure out what's going on around me? And that's figure out what's going on around me is the reading comprehension. And if you're still stuck thinking, what gear do I need to be in? Where do my feet need to be? Then, that's the unskilled reading. And so you're not going to have any comprehension going on. You won't have the bandwidth to look around and understand the bigger picture. So, I have to say, though, the experts are not really an actual final definition of dyslexia. Nobody has really yet come up with. It's not like we can say dyslexia is definitively this. But I think, would you have anything to add to that as a definition?
No, I think you've covered it really well. Yeah, I think it's pretty good. I guess maybe just mentioning that it is just a different way that the brain processes, and it is something children are born with. It's not something that develops, and it's not something that goes away. It's just something they'll have.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, we can do a lot and we can help a lot, but so we know what dyslexia is. It's that inability to just automatically read and spell with comprehension and with accuracy. So now I know what dyslexia is. How do I know if my child is dyslexic? Now, I put a few things together here. And I think this was a good moment if anybody's watching, or if you would like to take a minute to add anything into the chat or into the Facebook group. Let me have a look. Is anybody in the Facebook group? You can.
I've got a question that's come in, but I'm wondering if I might save this one till in a little bit.
Okay. What's the question, though?
So it says, could a child with dyslexia go on to study in university things such as medicine or engineering, and how could they support them to be able to achieve these things?
That's a good question. In theory, I would have to say it can depend on the severity of the dyslexia. That really is a thing. There are some children who are or some people who are so severely dyslexic that it can really be difficult. But it depends what they're studying as well. They may be brilliant thinkers, and they may be brilliant problem solvers, and then the university may be able to put some accommodations in place that would help them and support them. But then it would need a proper assessment by an educational psychologist, and then a plan that the university would then have to also have access to and work with the student with it. So I think in theory, if it's possible for that student to, if they're not so severely dyslexic that they just really can't read or write at all, in theory, it should be possible for everybody to do everything, but the reality is just different. And it comes down to having that assessment and then that plan and working together with the university and the student to see what's possible, I would say. But Yeah, those can be the limits sometimes, I think.
Yeah, I've taught some children who have dyslexia, and they've been the most diligent and hardworking. And I think if from a really young age they know that they find reading and writing a challenge, and they are taught different strategies and ways that they can be more independent and apply themselves. I think children like that who have had that support from a young age, potentially, that might increase their likelihood. But it is definitely worth putting that support in as early as you can.
Absolutely, super early support, 100% improves outcomes, absolutely. But it's so often with dyslexia, it's such an individual thing that you really have to look at the individual. I don't see why anybody shouldn't do anything, like I said, but the reality can often be different. And exactly that, the quicker you get the intervention, the much more likely they are to succeed in later life. There are all sorts of studies that show that. Yeah, so if there's anything else, pass it along. But one of the things so we're going to have a look in no particular order. How do I know if my child is dyslexic? So
This is a big one, I think, that a lot of people will find useful.
yeah. So if you want to drop anything in or send anything in, number one, I would say, is there dyslexia in your family? And I'm also going to say, in inverted commas, undiagnosed. There's such a genetic aspect to this, as I will show you a little bit later. And don't forget, we haven't known about dyslexia really for very long. So, if you think back into the history of your family, was granddad proud of never having read a book, but brilliant in the shed fixing this and that? You can probably pick up a few clues there. Also, you might want to think about, is there another learning difference in your family? So learning differences often co-occur, and in the literature they say this word comorbid, which sounds horrible, but it just means co-occur. And dyslexia may show up with other things like dyspraxia development, which is also called developmental coordination disorder. Is there any autism in your family? One thing I always did as a dyslexia specialist, the first question I ask myself is, what else is going on here? Because often things come together. So just take a good look at your family and try and figure out, is there anything else going on? Sometimes premature babies can show up as being dyslexic later on in life because of brain development is a little bit more challenged for them when they are born early. So that could be a thing. This is a big one. Has your child had significant hearing loss or reduction? If they have things like glue ear, they miss out on these awareness milestones. And by phonological awareness, it's those things that allow you to develop your sound processing capabilities, and those are crucial for reading development. Hearing loss is a big one, so get that checked. How is your child's eyesight? One of the things that shocked me as a dyslexia specialist, because one of the first things we do is send all children off to have their eyesight tested and their ears tested. I was surprised at how many young children are long-sighted, so they just couldn't see what was on the page. They weren't actually dyslexic. They just couldn't read what was there. So get some good eye testing done. Other signs, now some of these I wanted to say, and Adrienne, you will back me up in this, these are normal in the process of learning to read and write. It's just when it keeps on and on and on beyond, reasonable amounts of time, when all other children in the same situation have kind of passed this one by. So what do we have?
This is a big question that I get asked a lot, is why do the school want to wait to assess my child if they're showing all of these signs? And these are children in reception or year one. And although you might notice that your child is reversing letters, struggling to read, struggling to write, they are also in the very early stages of learning to read and write. So often, to get the most kind of accurate diagnosis, they need to see that actually your child's been taught all of these foundational skills. And if it goes on and becomes more apparent after some time, they'll then assess. So that's often why, although it can seem frustrating, schools will wait just to make sure that it's an accurate diagnosis.
So flipping letters is, I think, the famous one, isn't it? The P's and the Q's and the B's and the D's. I think that happens to just about every child when they're learning to write. So it's not just because your child flips letters doesn't necessarily mean they're dyslexic. When they are flipping letters 3 years into their reading and writing journey, that's when you need to start worrying, I think. This never getting beyond reading cat, dog, jug, pig. If that really isn't happening at a certain point, then that's an alarm bell.
Yeah.
The same with writing. It's the same process. One is active, one is passive. So, if your child cannot write, you sound up at, and they put a P and a B or something on the page. And this does happen in dyslexia assessments. That's a sign.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, difficulty recognizing or generating rhyme is one of the things. As a primary school teacher, with my year ones fresh out of their nursery schools, we did a lot of sitting down with nursery rhymes, with poetry. And one of the first things I was looking for is, can they finish off this rhyme for me? Can they generate this rhyme? So it's so valuable, all of these nursery rhymes, the poems, the songs, so valuable. Even if you're not reading to your children, keep the rhyming, the nursery rhymes, so valuable. So yeah, that's definitely one. This inability to generate spoonerisms as well. So we quite often do this accidentally. Everybody said chish and fips when they've meant fish and chips. And you ask children to do this deliberately and they can't do it. So that's another sign. And that's one of the things we look for in dyslexia assessments. Again, difficulty manipulating individual sounds. If you take H away from the word hat and replace it with what word do we have? And they just won't know. So that's another one. And you can just play that sort of casually with them and see how that works. Yeah. Watch out for spelling rules. They don't work. Often the first thing you want to do when you think your child is dyslexic is you want to say, well, just teach them the rules, teach them the spelling rules. This is the thing that will help them. But actually for a dyslexic brain, spelling rules just don't make an awful lot of sense quite often. So instead of teaching spelling rules, the better way to teach it is through morphology, which is just breaking down the chunks of the words that have meaning, showing them that this chunk means this, and then if you put these chunks together you get this kind of meaning, and that tends to help a bit more. So if you do suspect your child is dyslexic, keep a wary eye on whether rules do work for them or not, I would say.
I think as well, one of the things that I've noticed can be quite helpful is teaching children to break words down into chunks, and that might be into syllables, but actually that really kind of multi-sensory approach to learning how to spell as well, not necessarily just writing lines and lines of the same word, but building the word, whether that's in Play-Doh or getting magnetic letters or writing all the letters on Post-it notes and getting the child to move them around. So getting them to do it in a more hands-on way can also help it to stick.
Is super important as well. And just that focusing on those individual words is so important as well, because they're not at the point yet where they can read it in lots of context and understand it or figure out the meaning. And it helps so much with spelling if they can really focus on every individual letter, for sure. One thing a lot of dyslexics do is they read one word as a different but similar looking word. And what that's called is reading by partial cues. That should be reading by partial cues. Anyway, and so what happens is comprehension goes completely out of the window, because there's no way you could have understood that text if you read quite a few of the words as completely different words. So that's something, it's because it's not automatic yet. So they catch a general idea of what the word looks like, but then read it as something completely different. So see if you spot that. Again, one of the things I saw again and again and again is getting stuck on sounding out words that in no way, shape or form can ever be sounded out. But it's that relying on the only thing I've got, even if it doesn't work, because what isn't working, of course, is this automaticity. I can't just look at that and read it. The only way I've got to go at it is to try and sound it out. And you probably see that a lot as well.
Yeah, which I think often, when children misspell something, you can see that as a negative thing. But if you look at it really carefully, a lot of the time you can figure out why they've tried to spell it in that way. And I think praising children for that effort and for really trying to sound it out, even if it's not completely accurate, I think is worth recognizing too.
Particularly to write it down. So if a child is writing words that you can read, if they are phonetically in some way, shape or form fine, and you know what they mean, but they're not correct, that's fine with spelling. But when they're reading, if they're trying to sort of sound it out and they can't get there, then that's an alarm bell there. This is an interesting one. Easily losing their place when reading. That can happen maybe because of concentration, maybe they have some visual disturbance. Really handy just to have a ruler. You can get fancy things called reading rulers, but any ruler will do, and just get them to move it down the line as they're reading, and it just helps them keep their place. This is an interesting one. When you get children who are reading under their breath because they don't, this sort of whispering that's going on. What that tells you is, again, it's not automatic. They have to find a way of somehow getting it out of their mouth so it can go into their ears, and then they have some sort of hope of understanding it. So any child reading under their breath is not yet a skilled reader. And if that goes on, that's a very big clue that they need some support. This is a huge one. They're not understanding what they read. It's like we said before, if you're stuck in learner driver mode trying to figure out how the car actually works, you don't have that bandwidth to sort of pay attention to what's going on around you. And that's exactly what happens in unskilled reading. You're so busy trying to actually read the words that you've got no bandwidth to understand what's actually, going on in the whole text. That often shows up later, interestingly enough. Difficulty with word accuracy and sound processing challenges. You can, if your ear is tuned, listen to how people speak and know whether they are dyslexic or not. I did this very often and very accurately. And this is an example from somebody I was watching on TV who was talking about their roof terraced. And of course, it's a roof terrace. But because you know the word terraced house, so that thing like your patio must also be a terraced. It's a real inability to distinguish the fine differences between words and to kind of over apply the word there. So, I'll talk a bit about that later. Dazzled by bright white pages. That's a thing. Not everybody will like an overlay. One of the reasons this presentation is in this slightly darker or this bluey color is because I know that lots of people go, oh God, it's a bit bright, and then they really struggle with the visual stress of it. So overlays might help. I know somebody who was dyslexic, and the color that worked for her was orange. It might be blue for another child, or pink, or whatever it might be, but there's something about that can be helpful.
Schools are really great with this as well, and a lot of schools I know where I've worked it's just kind of an expectation that all of your learning materials and all of your presentations will have a pastel background, and it will never be white, because for what's good for children with dyslexia is good for all children. So most of the time people are pretty good at implementing things like that.
It's true. I always say this: if you teach every child, the whole class, as if they were all dyslexic, everybody would benefit from it. Absolutely. And that thing, I think, is just really, this is the tough one. I think they just work so much harder than everyone else for really not very great results quite often. And I have assessed children who I know very well are dyslexic, but because they have worked so hard and they've compensated so much, I have to come out of that assessment and say to the parents, actually, no, I can't say they're dyslexic, because they're slogging it, you know, and that's the tough thing. So if you do notice your child seems to be really, really working incredibly hard for maybe not particularly brilliant results, that could be a sign.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, the fluent reading is hard or isn't really happening. That's with it, it's not automatic. You know, you're in learner driver mode with it still,
Yeah.
sounding things out, trying to guess. Here we go. So we have got my children. You will have made your decisions about my children. And there's Sarah, there's Emma, there's Henry, and just to say they all went to the same state comprehensive school. There was nothing fancy, no private education, nothing apart from a regular state comprehensive. And they often had the same teachers. And the thing I kind of want to tell you about your children, maybe if they're like mine, is you can have very similar children in lots of ways who turn out to be very different. He is. I reckon most of you watching this probably thought, oh, it's got to be the boy. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Henry is dyslexic, and he is a baker. He was always very interested in food. So he's trained as an artisan baker. He's very much somebody who learns by watching. He's a very good understander of the bigger picture and processes in particular, and he can really spot the solution to things fast. And what has really surprised me is he's really understood the world of investing, and he's quite a skilled investor. He liked to play computer games a lot. I never did. Sarah and Emma never did. But it's a kind of way of thinking that kinds of worked for him. And this is the kind of thing that you don't see at school. How could I ever have known that this would have been his thing? How could I ever have known that he really sees problems and solutions quite easily? Because when children are little, they don't have that bigger picture. So he is the one who is dyslexic, and we'll talk a bit about him in detail. This has to be the meme, right? I couldn't resist. Some of you thought, oh, it's got to be the boy. Boys are always dyslexic. And if you thought that, I would say watch out for your daughters, kind of. If you thought it has to be the boy, it is because more boys are assessed as dyslexic. There is no reason, there's no biological or whatever reason that more boys are dyslexic than girls. It tends to be that girls are socialized to work harder to compensate for the dyslexia. And in 15 years in school, those children who I assessed for dyslexia, who I couldn't come out and say to the parents, yes, your daughter is dyslexic, were those girls who worked incredibly hard to compensate. I never once said it about a boy. And I think that's the way society somehow works, but that's just my experience. I knew very soon that he was dyslexic. That's because I kind of knew what I was looking for, and I knew it before he could read, write, or his speech was fully developed. And one of those questions that came in earlier is dyslexia just about reading difficulties? And it isn't. And we'll talk about a few of the things that were hard for him. The reason I knew with him is because we have a family history of dyslexia. The left-handers in my family are dyslexic. He's left-handed. So when Sarah and Emma were right-handed and he turned out to be left-handed, I thought, okay, here we go. And so the question you might have is, are left-handers more likely to be dyslexic? The research shows that there's a link between dyslexia and mixed-handedness, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and the reference is down at the bottom if you want to chase that one up. It's a meta-study. He is left-handed. He's very dominantly left-handed, but he's right foot and he's right eye dominant. So he's got that mixed. It's not quite mixed-handedness, but it's a kind of a crossover. So the research shows that. Okay, he's 22. Things have turned out better than I might have hoped. So if you are in the trenches with a primary school child at the moment, they really have turned out better than I could have hoped. So should we have a look and see? So I talked a lot about language processing and other things, and I want to talk about how, with him, just as a case study, it shows up way beyond reading and spelling. Now, he's bilingual, English, German, but it took him ages to separate and develop the languages in a way it didn't for his sisters. And he's incredibly orally strong, surprisingly good vocabulary, clear, speaker, everything, but his writing, and I quote him, is a disaster. It's just not something he likes to do. You often see dyslexia showing up as word-finding difficulties, that tip of the tongue, you know, you can almost get the word out, but you can't quite get it out. And that's that not being automatic, you know, not automatic reading, not automatic writing, and that kind of accessing that word to get it out was difficult for him. He would mix up his words in the same area. So he wanted to say pizza. He said pizza, he meant spaghetti. So if you find your child kind of coming out with more or less the right word, but not quite the right word, that could be a sign. Often about food. He's very interested in food. Here's the less robust working memory, which is a very big part of dyslexia. His teacher would tell me, I sit them all at the front, I tell them to do this, and then this, and then this, and then by the time he's back in his seat, he doesn't know where to begin. So if your teacher is, your child's teacher is saying to you, he has difficulty kind of following instructions, that's a good sign that it could be dyslexia.
Was there anything, because obviously at home, you know, with your children, you give instructions all the time and maybe get a little bit frustrated if they don't then do it. Is there anything that worked with Henry that parents could try?
I honestly have to say he had two very dominant older sisters. So in my case, I would ask him to do things that he didn't do. So his sisters would swoop in and do it. The thing that you can do, though, if children do have difficulty with instructions, and it's something that I did in class a lot, is you either just give one instruction at a time, and then you make sure that they've got that, and then you give the next instruction. Or what I quite often did, if the children were a bit more able, actually not even if they were able to read, I would quite often just put a graphic up on the board so they had a visual somewhere, so they knew that they had to do it. And I also think too, if these are things that have to be repeated, just train them up to do it.
Yeah.
Make it automatic by just keeping going.
Yeah.
But don't get frustrated if they don't remember, because it's often that they do want to, but they just can't. So break it down, make it visual, and then train it up as a habit if you possibly can.
I had a child in my class who was dyslexic, and he found getting changed for PE quite difficult because he forgot the order to do things. So we just had photos, and along the top of his desk, he had a photograph of his clothing items. And he knew he had to take his shoes off, take his socks off, you know, and the order of things. And he didn't then have to remember because he could just look at the picture and then he knew what to do.
That's a brilliant thing. And then at some point it becomes automatic, right?
Exactly.
Because he's looked at the pictures and then he just learns it. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Excellent. What else? Oh, the thing I said earlier about spelling rules, it's often a temptation to say, well, just teach them the rules. But for him, they were just too abstract. And when he did learn a rule, he would so over apply it, it would be everywhere, and it would also be a disaster. So just keep an eye on, don't automatically default to rules for things because they might not work. Super erratic spelling. This is a real, you'll know this, right? When you see a piece of writing and the same word is wrongly spelt 3 or 4 different ways. Yeah. Here's one. Couldn't use the locker padlock. Had one of those, 3 left, 2 right, 4 left sequences. This is one of the key things with dyslexia. Sequences are hard for dyslexic thinkers to retain. So also, he's not very good at reading analog clocks. So he prefers digital clocks. It's just a processing thing. And not being able to use a padlock or tell the time, you think, well, oh God, reading. Oh dear. He didn't like reading. And so we read to him a lot. He had a lot of audiobooks. He quite liked watching the telly. And I have to say, as a parent, I felt very guilty about that. But when I think back on it, because Sarah and Emma, my daughters, really never were much bothered about television, but he was addicted. And I felt really guilty about it, but it was his way of kind of gaining information. But what I did do is I didn't let him just watch any old thing. It was quite carefully curated. So if you have a child who doesn't like reading and you're doing all the things and the audiobooks and you're reading with them, if they do kind of like telly, just curate what they're watching, and then it's fine. And even today, he doesn't read. He doesn't get that. He doesn't really understand what reading for pleasure is. Gets his information from YouTube. So yeah, you sometimes just have to go with it, even if it feels difficult. This is the thing, really. I mean, it's advocating for him and just keeping his self-esteem intact. And he knows his self-worth is not based on academic success in the context of our family. You know, these two sisters who just lived and breathed school. And it just wasn't his thing. And he does really understand the challenges of dyslexia. So we talk about it all the time still, actually, that, you know, it's just how your brain works. And it's got, you know, it's not a reflection on you. You're not a failure because you don't have a PhD in biochemical engineering. You know, and he gets that, I think, pretty well. So that's a lot to do. So you think, like I did, I think my child might be dyslexic. What do I do? And even though I kind of knew, and even though it was coming, and it's still hard. It's still hard, even, you know, in my situation, when you know, we had him assessed, and, you know, the result came back, and yeah, he's dyslexic and all the rest of it. It still feels like a bit of a punch in the gut, because you don't want things to be harder for your child than they need to be. So, I have to say, he was tutored, and he was tutored, and he was tutored. That was the thing that saved us. We got him tutored very early on, and I have to say, I did not tutor him, because I think it's a big enough job being a parent, and to also be a teacher is really hard. And he was tutored early on to just close that gap, because, you know, he didn't get the basics, and if he wasn't getting the basics, the gap was going to get bigger. So he was definitely, you know, very tutored as a primary school child. And it might not be over at the other end. When he was in his final year at school, when he was 16, I said to him, look, I think some tutoring would be good. After the summer holidays, at the beginning of your final year, let's put the tutor, let's get it in place. Let's get the language and let's get the maths tutored. And of course, he was a 15, 16-year-old, you know, oh, no, I don't want that. I don't need that. So, you know, as a parent, you're kind of stuck. And then I said to him, okay, then not. And then it got to the October half term. And then I said to him, look, I think we should probably, you know, you should go and do a bit of tutoring. I know, I get it. It's difficult. It's an extra. And because I said to him, if you don't do it now, there is no point. If you don't start early enough, there's no point 4 weeks before the exam trying to get tutored. It's just too late. You have to put it in early. And at that point, he agreed. And so he was tutored again at 16 for that final year of school. And it actually, amazingly, got him through his final exams. And he did okay. But without that real consistent tutoring as a primary school kid, and without that extra boost as a sort of 15, 16-year-old. Yeah. And also he too, just to go back to Sarah and Emma, I said they went to school a year early. He went to school a year late. So he went effectively 2 years later than his sisters, because he just needed that extra bit of time. So that might be something that you find if your child just needs longer. Yeah, so stay calm. It will be a journey. Hold your nerve. You will get there. And this is what I would recommend you do. Get the basics done. Can they hear? Can they see? That's key. Have a good old chat with your teacher, but I would always say trust your instincts beyond anything anyone says. Teachers can be absolutely brilliant, but if there's a niggle, you know your child best. And if you're thinking, I think there might be something up here, even if you just get some help to rule it out, you know, that can also be good, but follow your gut on that one. The very last thing you want to do is wait. Thinking things will sort them out is absolutely not the way to go, because, you know, the further behind they are, the further behind they get. That gap just gets wider. And as I said with Henry, he was absolutely solidly tutored through primary school, and it kept him up. So he kind of launched well into secondary school, and then we had to pick it up again at the end just to get him through the exams. So, yeah. Yeah, so the earlier you get help, the better. That was certainly key in my experience as a parent and as a teacher. Get an experienced tutor on your side. He was tutored by some really good, experienced teachers who were also tutored, and it's the only way to, avoid that attainment gap. It saved him. And if you really, 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 really think he's dyslexic or she's dyslexic, then get your child assessed by a qualified dyslexia specialist. It's the only way to be sure. And the people who assess for dyslexia, one of the great things about it is you know what you're looking for. You just know. Somebody who can assess for dyslexia, they just know what they're looking for. So go for that as well. It's the only way to be 100% sure.